Hey everyone, how's it going? Today I want to talk about aircraft that were late to the party, so to speak. What I mean by this is aircraft designs that got accepted for combat use, and just as they started seeing use or were on their way to start seeing use, the war ended, or the country using them surrendered. Two great examples of the former exist in the F-7F Tiger Cat and F-8F Bearcat, a twin-engine heavy fighter and a single-engine fighter, respectively, both initially designed for carrier-based service. In the closing months of World War II and the Pacific War, land-based variants of the F-7F and the normal carrier-based version of the F-8F had made their way to combat units, and those units were being trained in their respective aircraft. And then, quite literally, just as both the F-7F and F-8F were en route to the Pacific Theater to fight Japan and participate in a full-scale ground invasion of the Japanese homeland, the atomic bombs were dropped and Japan surrendered shortly thereafter. The F-7F and F-8F showed up to the party, but everybody was going home, and the party hosts were starting to clean up the mess that was left. What this meant for those two planes, and for aviation history as a whole, is that two of the fastest and most powerful piston engine aircraft of World War II never got to see combat in it, which is both fortunate for Japan in that they didn't have to lose more planes and men to the two aircraft, and also kind of unfortunate for us today, in that we never got any kind of definitive live combat results against late-war Japanese aircraft. But there's another side to the late-to-the-party coin, where the country making the aircraft is on the losing end of the conflict, and the late-arriving design is either desperately thrown to the wolves in a vain effort to save their country, or it arrives just as the country falls, and is never able to make the impact it was intended to. It's one of these late-arriving aircraft that I want to talk about today, an Italian fighter that was actually an incredibly powerful one, at least in theory and on paper. This is the Fiat G.55 Centauro. The story of this fashionably late superplane begins all the way back in 1935, with the Italian Air Force recognizing their desperate need to modernize their aerial forces and bring about the era of the monoplane fighter. At that time, the bulk of their fighter forces consisted of biplanes, largely the Fiat CR-30 and the Fiat CR-32. And while these designs weren't terrible by biplane standards, their top speeds just barely breached the 200-mile-an-hour mark. And that same year, Germany's Bf-109 prototype would take to the air, and work was being done on what would become the Supermarine Spitfire. Other major powers were making serious progress on what would be their mainline World War II-era fighters. And if Italy wanted to keep pace and be a major power, then they needed to modernize. To this end, Italy's Air Ministry announced a new design competition in 1935 for a more modern, higher-power interceptor. But this competition was quickly cancelled with no submitted design selected, as none of the designs that were proposed, whatever they were viewed as being sufficient enough for the role and the time. This then led to a similar competition being issued in January 1936, and from this one, Italy would see two modern fighters born, in the Fiat G.50 and the Macchi C.205. But even by early World War II standards, these two designs were pretty lackluster, and Fiat G.50 was probably the runt of the two. First taking to the air in February 1937, powered by a Fiat A74 radial engine with 840 horsepower, the all-metal monoplane did represent a significant leap forward for Italy's fighter forces, it being their first all-metal monoplane. While it was reported to control rather well and offered excellent maneuverability, its top speed of just 293 miles an hour was pretty disappointing, and its armament of just two 12.7mm machine guns with only 150 rounds per gun realistically meant that it did not possess the speed and power to be a viable frontline fighter for a major power. Nevertheless, though, the G50 would be ordered for production. Initially, this order was quite small, just 45 aircraft, and then shortly after this order was placed, its competitor in the Macchi C.205 would take to the air. Despite using the exact same A74 engine, the C.205 was actually able to breach the 300-mile-an-hour mark, hitting 313, and also armed with two 12.7mm machine guns. While it was also pretty weak, it was at least equal to the G50. And surprisingly though, even though the G50 was slower, it was initially viewed as being the better of the two aircraft, and was actually declared the winner. This was at least ostensibly due to the G50's greater maneuverability, and probably the fact that it was considered easier to produce. But I do also suspect that the fact that Fiat aircraft had made up the bulk of Italy's aerial forces in the years prior also contributed to the G50's victory. Kinda like some aircraft nepotism. It's like the G50 was a nepo baby. And yet, despite the fact that the C.205 ended up losing the competition, it actually ended up seeing a greater production run over 1,000 strong, compared to the nearly 700 G50s. At least partially this was due to the C.205's better speed, but it was also because Fiat decided to make and promote to the Air Ministry the CR-42 Falco, an improved version of the CR-32 biplane, outfit with the A74 engine with a top speed of 274 miles an hour. While the CR-42 was slower than either of the new monoplane fighters, and initially it actually had a weaker armament of just one 7.7mm machine gun and one 12.7mm machine gun, it was nevertheless welcomed with open arms by the Air Ministry, and nearly 2,000 of them would be produced, making it the most prevalent and numerous Italian aircraft in World War II. But as World War II neared and began, it became very clear to the Italian Air Ministry that they would need to improve upon their line of monoplane fighters, and largely this improvement would come about via German influence. Initially, Italy would receive permission to construct a licensed version of the Daimler-Benz DB601 engine, with roughly 1,200 horsepower. Competitors Reggiane and Macchi both set about utilizing this new higher power engine in their designs like the RE2001 and the C202. Fiat would also technically follow in this trend by creating the G52, but only one of them was ever made, and not very much attention was given to it by Fiat. Instead, Fiat would focus more on a different engine initially in the A38, a 1,200 horsepower engine that drove contra-rotating propellers. However, this engine never really came to fruition, and instead Fiat turned their attention to another German engine in the DB605. Fiat would then be tasked with the licensed construction of this engine, under the designation of RA1050, and for this engine, Fiat would design their G50 successor in the G.55. Measuring in at 9.37 meters long, 11.85 meters wide, and 3.13 meters tall, the G.55 was a little bit larger than the G.50, and with a gross weight of 7,760 pounds, it was a good 2,500 pounds heavier than the G50. With its substantially stronger licensed DB605 engine with nearly 1,500 horsepower, the G55 would reach a top speed between 385 and 390 miles an hour, about 100 miles an hour faster than the G50. Also substantially improved would be its armament, and it would go from just two 12.7mm machine guns up to a 20mm cannon firing centrally and four 12.7mm machine guns. Not to be left behind, though, both Macchi and Reggiane would design new fighters that utilize the DB605 in the C.205 and RE.2005, respectively, and the three planes would form what was known as Italy's Series 5 fighters, named as such due to the DB605 engine, and through 1942, as all of them would take to the air for the first time that year, the Italian Air Ministry would compare them against one another in what was now effectively another design competition. Macchi's C.205 would be the first to take to the air on April 19, 1942. The G.55 would follow on April 30th, and the RE.2005 would follow on May 9th. It should also be noted that the C.205 that flew here was a slightly more rudimentary version than what Macchi had intended, and later that year in November, the more intended and desired version of it would take to the air as well, with all three planes undergoing testing, with data gathered and the opinions of the test pilots noted. The end result was that, perhaps unsurprisingly, all three of these planes performed pretty similarly. I mean, they all had the same engine, they looked kind of similar, and were relatively close in their gross weights. But if you split some hairs and factored in slight differences in their performance, one plane would nearly sweep the competition's categories, and that plane was none other than the Macchi C.205. Now, the difference between first, second, and third was certainly small, but when considering top speed, maneuverability, climb rate, the C.205 would come out slightly on top, with the G.55 in a close second, and the RE.2005 in a close third. But there were three factors that the G.55 won out on, though, and that was ease of production, projected growth, or how the plane could grow and evolve down the line, and high-altitude performance. The G.55 was a little bit larger dimensionally than the other two aircraft, and while this may have hampered it slightly in its overall performance department, it also meant that it would be able to fit bigger and more powerful engines down the line if and when they came along. And with its slightly larger wings and greater wingspan, its control and overall performance at high altitudes was greater as well. But considering that the C.205 was the overall winner with its slightly superior performance, logic would have it that it would then receive the largest total number of orders. But no, instead the G.55 did, and it was effectively intended to be Italy's modern fighter of the future. On the surface, the reason behind this decision lie in those factors of ease of production and future growth, with the G.55 being considered the easiest to make, and thus the best fighter with which to quickly outfit the Italian Air Force with a new modern fighter, and with its slightly larger size, ideally its frame would be able to, later on, fit the stronger DB603 engine without much modification. But according to Gregory Alleghi, Italian military historian, in an article in the Aviation Historian, linked to it down in the description, the selection of the G.55 may have also, at least a little bit, been due to Fiat pressuring the Air Ministry and employing some backhanded tactics in an effort to increase their own sales and maintain their prominence in Italy's military. The Macchi C.205, specifically an earlier variant of it in the 205V, would receive an order not too long after its initial flight, and Fiat would be tasked with producing a number of them under contract, around 300. Seemingly not wanting to admit that they had lost in some way, and not wanting to produce a competitor's design, Fiat intentionally slow-rolled the production of the C.205, and continually pestered the Air Ministry about them instead shifting their focus over to the G.55. The Air Ministry, though, would stick to their guns, and ordered Fiat, no matter what happened to the G.55, regardless of if its performance improved past the C.205, Fiat was tasked with producing 300 C.205s. Luckily for Fiat, though, it turned out that they wouldn't have to fulfill this commitment, due to a British raid on Fiat factories in November 1942 that damaged their production lines for the CR-42 biplane and the C.205. At minimum, this would significantly hamper their ability to produce the C.205, and realistically, it effectively ended up freeing Fiat from this obligation. Roughly around the time their facilities were attacked, the Air Ministry would elect to bring the G.55 into mass production, and they would give Fiat an initial order for 600 aircraft that would quickly grow to several thousand. Again, on the surface, this was due to the G.55 being easier to produce, but it isn't hard to connect the dots a little bit. With Fiat promoting the G.55 and basically refusing to make the C.205, production of the C.205 was very slow. Getting Fiat fully behind a project so that production of an aircraft could really ramp up was probably more important than the slight boost in performance that the C.205 offered. And combine that with the G.55's ease of production, it just made more sense to bring it into production. And then with the damaging of Fiat's factories that would hamper their C.205 production, that was the effective final nail in the coffin on the C.205's mass production dreams, and attention would shift over to the G.55. Now, despite Fiat receiving much more attention for the G.55 just as they had wanted, their production of it was painfully slow. With production beginning in earnest, and I say that in very large quotation marks, in early 1943, the first 15 or so G.55s that rolled off the line were the G.55-0, which was basically just the prototype model put into production. Then the next 15 or so models were the G.55-1, that had an improved armament of 3 20mm cannons and 2 12.7mm machine guns. But after these 55-1s were delivered, it was already September 1943, and on September 8th, Italy surrendered. So in the span of several months, Fiat had only managed to produce about 30 G.55s, 30 of the easier-to-produce fighter. So what happened here? The biggest reason for this glacial production was the sheer lack of Italian-built DB605s. Fiat was also the producer of these engines, but with a monthly production output of them that didn't even reach 100, and with other designs using that engine as well, there weren't nearly enough engines to go around, and so any plane that used it suffered quite a bit as a result. But purely due to geographic reasons, the surrender of Italy did not spell the end for the G.55 or its production, although its production would never reach the planned several thousand, not even remotely close. The Fiat factory that was producing the G55 was located in Turin, in northwestern Italy, nestled right in the crescent of the Alps. After Italy surrendered, Germany quickly moved in, took control of the northern half of Italy, freed Benito Mussolini after he had been removed from office and arrested in July 1943, and established a puppet state in the Italian Social Republic, once again headed by Mussolini. And since the factory in Turin remained under Axis control, production of the G55 for Axis use could continue. But even now, sitting under de facto German control, and probably having better access to the actual DB605 engine, production of the G55 didn't ramp up. And due to Germany's worsening war situation, the total number of delivered G55s sat between just 100 and 150 by the time the war ended. Germany had plans to produce several hundred of them, including 2 new models in the G55-2 that had 5 20mm cannons and the G55S that would be a torpedo bomber, but those models were never made. And due to there being so few G55s, records of how they performed under German puppet hands are just about non-existent. It is known that a number of the available G55s did end up making their way to Italian units and did serve, but exactly how they performed seems to have been lost to time. And even then, due to their limited production and being under German control, the G55 didn't serve for very long and would later be replaced by the Bf-109G. After the war ended, Italy and Fiat would actually continue production of the G55, albeit still in very small numbers, both to serve as a trainer and as an export aircraft. Smaller, non-major powers after the war were interested in the design in what would be for them a solid addition to their aerial forces, and countries like Argentina, Syria, and Egypt collectively ordered about 100 of them. Overall, though, the story of the G55 is both a story of a plane that was late to the party, showing up just as Italy was falling, and a story of a plane that was kinda steeped in behind-the-scenes drama and basically nepotism, with Fiat's prominence in Italian military aviation. As a company, they could probably get away with a lot more than a smaller company could have, and with them effectively refusing to make the C.205, that helped to push the G55 into greater prominence. At least it helped a little bit. While there were definitely reasons for the Air Ministry to produce the G55 over the C.205, Fiat pressing their thumb on the scale a little bit there very likely led to it receiving more orders that numbered into the thousands. Fiat effectively said to Macchi and the Air Ministry, "I won't hire their kid unless you hire mine." And they did effectively end up getting their way. And then Fiat didn't even have to hire Macchi's kid, so it was a win-win for them. Alright, and with that, we're going to go ahead and end for today. So, thank you all for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Now, strange question. Have any of you ever popped a rib? I did that a few weeks ago, and I'm still feeling the effects of it. It's definitely a lot better, it's definitely healing, but it's funny how one tiny little mistake led to weeks of pain. Basically, I had to twist a cap off of a large cardboard tube, one that was like the length of my forearm, and the cap didn't want to come off for some reason, so I put the tube under my arm, I twisted the cap, and I just felt my rib press in, like you're pressing down on a stapler. Very uncomfortable, I wouldn't recommend it. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something. So, see ya.